Hey Lang nerds, welcome to eLang Explained. This video is a part of our core curriculum series where we break down some of the key concepts and pieces of meta-language from units 1 to 4 English language. So get excited for today's episode because today we're talking about tenor. So, what is tenor? As a concept, it's really important to remember that tenor has 3 dimensions, and that when we're analysing tenor, we're really analysing the ideas of role, power, and social distance. So when we're thinking about that first dimension, role within a text, we're thinking about what are the expectations of each participant? What is their job? What are they supposed to do within the text? So in this text, for example, my role is to explain the concept of tenor to you, the audience. And you, as the audience of listeners, are expected to be thinking critically about how you can use the information contained in this video on tenor in future analysis. The next dimension is power. And so when we're thinking about power within a text, it's important for us to first label the power that is present. Is there a superordinate, someone with more power? Is there a subordinate, someone who has less power? Or is this a discourse between equals with the same or a similar level of power? Once we've identified the levels of power present, it's then important for us to consider what are the expectations of a person who has this power within a text. Then the last dimension is social distance. And this, of course, is that breadth of distance in a relationship between. And this, of course, refers to the relationship between the participants in a discourse. So in texts where there's a close social distance, we're looking at a text that involves people who know each other well, who care about the other people and have that close social distance. Whereas in texts that have a wide social distance, that's where we're looking at a text where the people might not know each other as well. And they aren't using as much language to maintain the other's positive face because there's not that close social distance and closer relationship. Whenever we're analysing tenor, it's really important to remember that these dimensions of tenor aren't individual. They all come together to form tenor, and they're often very closely related. There are, in any text that has a superordinate, often very fixed expectations of their role in a text. And in texts that have a wider social distance, we're much more likely to see those formalised roles being adhered to by the participants. Whenever we're analysing tenor, we should always be aiming to label the tenor of a text using an adjective that best describes the relationship between the participants in that discourse. So, we're going to have a look now at some possible adjectives that we could use to label tenor in a text, and have a think about the qualities associated with each of these tenors. The first tenor we're going to discuss is a friendly tenor. So, texts that have a friendly tenor are those kind of texts that are using language to reflect the close social distance between participants. These texts also often involve participants who have equal power and are focused on using their language to deliberately build rapport with the other participants, reflect a close social distance, or foster intimacy or solidarity with their listeners. Texts that have a friendly tenor can include things like conversations between friends who are talking about what to do on the weekend. Whereas our next tenor, a personal tenor, is more about deliberate use of language to reflect the close social distance between participants who often already have an established relationship. We can use language that is friendly and reflects that friendly tenor with people that we might already know or we might be meeting for the first time. But a personal tenor is often more linked to those pre-established relationships. And so this one might be a phone call between close friends about whether they should go to the cinema or the beach. And we might see that personal tenor reflected in the fact that these close friends might initially disagree on what they would most like to do on the weekend. But because they have that already established relationship, they'll be able to use language that maintains each other's positive face to reach a solution they're both happy with. When we think about a personal or a friendly tenor, we're also often thinking about informal texts. So let's have a look at 2 tenors that might apply more to a formal register. Our third tenor is an authoritative tenor. And texts that have this tenor are using language to deliberately establish the expertise of the participants and reinforce their authority in a specific field that they're discussing. So an example of a text that has an authoritative tenor might be a summary video about the concept of tenor using jargon from the field of VCE English language. Hopefully, the language that I'm using in this video, and specifically that elang jargon, is something that we can both access. And so here, my very deliberate use of jargon from the English language field hopefully is helping to reinforce that authoritative tenor. Our fourth tenor, though, is a hostile or antagonistic tenor, and this is kind of the pair to that friendly tenor. Because texts that have a hostile or antagonistic tenor are using language to reflect a wide social distance between participants through language that might challenge the positive and negative face or negative face of the other participants in the discourse. A hostile or antagonistic tenor, unlike that friendly tenor, is often seen in texts where participants have clearly established roles, different levels of power, and a very wide social distance. And so a text that might have an authoritative tenor could be something like a conversation between a customer and a store employee where the customer is expressing their frustration at waiting in a long line at the checkout. And they're using language here to reflect the fact that as a customer, there are expectations. And they're using language here to reflect both their frustration, but also the fact that they probably haven't met this store employee before. And so in terms of role, in this example, we would see that customer using language to reflect the wide social distance they have with the employee, who they probably haven't met before and may be unlikely to see again. Now, our last two tenors for today include the professional and diplomatic tenors. It's important to remember that while some tenors are more closely associated with particular registers, these tenor adjectives could actually apply to a text of any register. And we can absolutely have a text that is formal that has a professional tenor, but we equally could have an informal text that still has that professional tenor, because texts that have a professional tenor are deliberately using language to establish the expertise of a participant in the field of the discourse and reinforce their authority and control within the text. Texts that have a professional tenor also often include participants who have that wider social distance and very fixed roles within the discourse. An example of this might be a VCE English language revision lecture, which is delivered by a teacher to a group of students. And in this discourse, the role of the teacher is, of course, to present that revision lecture, but the role of the students here is to be much more active and to ask questions for clarification to help consolidate their knowledge. The last tenor we're going to discuss today is a diplomatic tenor. And texts that have a diplomatic tenor are deliberately using language to carefully address topics that may be sensitive or taboo in an objective way that minimizes face challenging acts, that makes the people and that makes the participants in this discourse feel more comfortable discussing these potentially sensitive topics. Texts with this kind of tenor also involve language that carefully considers the social distance, power, and roles of the participants to really carefully present information. And so here, for our diplomatic tenor, we could look at something like the Reserve Bank of Australia presenting updates on the cash rate, where the Reserve Bank of Australia will be using language very deliberately to carefully present the key points and their key justifications and explanations on the cash rate. So, when we're justifying tenor, specifically justifying your identification of tenor with one of the adjectives that we've talked about, it's important to remember how the specific language features in a text reflect the power, the role, and the social distance. And so when we're thinking about justifying tenor, we might look first at power. And so we'll be carefully considering how the language used in the text reflects the power that each participant holds, including whether this power is equal or if one participant has more power. We'll also be carefully considering how specific language features reflect role, including the expectations of language use associated with this role in contemporary Australia. And then lastly, we'll be carefully considering how the use of language reflects the social distance between participants, including both that initial identification of whether we've got a close or a wide social distance, and then how the language use reflects expectations of a discourse where participants have this social distance. Now, the one other thing that I will add here for you all to remember is that the tenor adjectives listed in these slides, in this presentation, aren't definitive. There are lots of adjectives that we could put towards tenor. And it's really important that, whichever adjective you choose, your analysis is able to carefully, clearly, and in a really nuanced way, unpack these dimensions of power, role, and social distance. So, we're going to have a look at today is an excerpt taken from a press conference where Michelle Bullock, who is the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, the RBA, presented the RBA's monetary policy decision on the 12th of August. Now, in this excerpt, we're going to specifically look at the way that Bullock is taking questions from reporters from ABC News, Sky News, the Australian Financial Review, and Nine newspapers. But if you're a keen green bean and you're keen and interested in reading the full press conference, then you can access this on the RBA's website. Because we're looking at 4 different excerpts today, I'm going to give you a little bit of time for each to have a read of the question and Bullock's response, and then we're going to talk about how we're seeing tenor used. Because tenor is related to those 3 dimensions of role, power, and social distance, we can actually, from this contextual factors box, start inferring some things about what we're expecting to see. Michelle Bullock is the Governor of the RBA, and her role in this text is going to be to clarify information about the monetary policy decision, which means that we can also infer that the role of the reporters from ABC News, Sky News, the Australian Financial Review, and Nine newspapers is going to be to ask questions to get that further clarification, to prompt language from Bullock that will help them and their readers understand the reasons for this decision. In terms of power, as Governor of the RBA, Bullock is someone who absolutely is going to be the superordinate in this situation, that she is the one who has the most power here. In terms of social distance, this one is a little bit trickier because in this very specific setting of a press conference where the RBA are unpacking their monetary policy decision, we don't actually know if these reporters have an existing social distance with Bullock. But because of the fixed role that Bullock has as Governor of the RBA, we can assume that there probably is a wider social distance between Bullock and these individual reporters. Let's have a look at this first excerpt together. So this is the question from ABC News, where David Chow says, what would you say is an appropriate level for interest rates, one that doesn't stimulate or slow down the economy? In other words, the neutral rate. And we've got our first example of jargon here with that noun phrase neutral rate. We've also got interest rates, which potentially you could also argue is jargon. Remember, anytime we discuss jargon though, we're also aiming to identify the field that this jargon comes from. And so for both interest rate and neutral rate, I think you would definitely be able to identify this as jargon from the field of finance. Now, in terms of tenor, we've absolutely got a professional tenor here, because Bullock and Chow are both using language that upholds the expectations of their role. Chow uses an interrogative, and then Bullock is able to respond with some declaratives. In terms of power, we can see that in this question from ABC News, we've got that personal pronoun you, whereas in Bullock's response, she uses the proper noun David to refer to this specific reporter. And while Bullock absolutely here has that purpose of clarifying information, we're seeing language that is very much reflective of the wide social distance, the role of Bullock as the superordinate. We're definitely seeing language that reflects the role, power, and social distance that Bullock and Chow have. If you can see a language feature here that you think justifies that professional tenor, make sure to add it in the comments. So the next excerpt we're going to have a look at is a question from Edward Boyd from Sky News. In this question, unlike the question from ABC News, which didn't use language that had a positive or negative connotation when talking about that neutral rate, we're seeing some language here that has a negative connotation with the adjective worse. Now, Bullock responds with 2 very short, simple sentences. And we've got the use of that personal pronoun we to refer to both Bullock, but also all of the people who are working at the RBA. And so we can note here that there is a little bit of a tenor shift. It's still professional, absolutely. But perhaps there's a case here to argue that this tenor is a little bit more antagonistic. It's not hostile because Bullock and Boyd are still reflecting those expectations that we have of their role in this text. Boyd is still asking a question to clarify information about the RBA's decision, and Bullock is responding with declarative sentences to really clearly clarify that information about the RBA's decision. But if we have a look at this excerpt between Bullock and Michael Reid from the Australian Financial Review, we see the tenor shift a little bit as well. Because unlike the previous two questions, where an interrogative has been asked and then Bullock has responded with a declarative, here the Australian Financial Review asks an interrogative, but Bullock responds with an interrogative. Here, perhaps using language that indicates a closer social distance between Bullock and Reid, because Bullock is more comfortable responding to an interrogative with an interrogative. So, while we wouldn't say that this tenor is friendly, this excerpt perhaps is indicating more of that personal tenor, because it is showing a different side to the social distance that Bullock may have with these reporters through the use of language that allows Bullock and Reid to have almost a mini conversation at this press conference. The final excerpt we're going to talk about today is this question and answer from Shane Wright from Nine Newspapers. And I deliberately chose this excerpt because unlike all of the other reporters at this press conference, Wright deliberately begins the question from Nine Newspapers with the alliterative "G'day, Governor," using that Australian colloquialism of "G'day." And here, if we were going to analyse tenor, while like all of the other excerpts, we're still seeing that professional tenor. We're still seeing Bullock use an authoritative tenor to present expertise and reinforce that authority in the field of finance. It's really interesting that Wright has deliberately begun with a colloquialism here, something that we would often see in texts that have that more personal tenor. Bullock responds, though, with some jargon, talking about competition, bailiwicks, the ACCC. And it's interesting here to analyse tenor, because Wright is using language initially that is perhaps showcasing more of a personal tenor. But then in that second sentence, goes back to using language that reflects our expectations of language use at a press conference and his role as a reporter who is asking questions to the governor of the RBA. So it's interesting that Wright deliberately chose to begin with "G'day," something that perhaps challenges our expectations of the role, power, and social distance that we can see as part of this text. After that quick discussion of the excerpts, make sure that your next analysis of tenor focuses on the relationship between the participants and is really able to dissect the nuances of each dimension of tenor, focusing specifically on role, power, and social distance. But that's all we have time for today. Remember to be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time for more Elang Explained.